So we'll get started. So hi everyone, my name is Marcus Tyler. I'm Marketing Comms Assistant at Surrey FA. Here tonight for our Keeping Players Connected webinar with Scott, Stuart and Ben. I'll leave Mike to do the introductions in a little bit, but just a bit of housekeeping. Right at the top, you can all see my screen right now anyway. So right at the top, the second in from the left, it should say show Q&A. So if you went on there and if you have a question anytime throughout the bit of backlash on that. If you have if you have a question throughout, please just type it in there, and then we will try and get that answered during the end of the session. As always, if we do get some questions that come in and we can't answer them, we're sorry, but we can't guarantee that every question will be answered. And yeah, just keep yourselves on mute and your video off, and we'll get started. So I'll hand over to Mike, and he can do some instructions.
Thanks, Marcus, and hi everybody that's on the call. My name's Mike Gilham. I'm head of football development at Surrey FA. We're delighted to have our three guests tonight, and we're delighted to really carry on with some of our coaching content. And start off with a thank you for bearing with us as we experience some technical difficulties. So Microsoft Teams is software we have from the FA, but it doesn't appear to be playing ball tonight. But I believe we've got our three guest speakers dialed in, so we have got them. They are here to add some value to this workshop tonight. We just felt that the topic keeping players connected would be really sort of pertinent and topical at the moment. There's a real challenge for us all as coaches as to how we can connect with our players and keep them engaged really over through a pandemic. I'll let the guys introduce themselves properly in a minute, but I think just to say from Surrey FA's perspective, what we've tried to do on tonight's call is give a real range of speakers. So Scott Guyett, who joins us from Crystal Palace, his role is with the first team at Crystal Palace. So we've got somebody working with professional players in the Premier League. They've managed to expedite through coronavirus sort of protocol and get themselves back training with obviously the return to Premier League. We've then got Ben Bartlett from Fulham, who works in the academy there. And again, I'll let him introduce himself in a minute. But Ben's worked across grassroots football, women and girls football, and now in the professional game for a number of years and understands the whole pathway all the way through the game. Then we've got Stuart Lamb, who joins us as a grassroots coach from one of our charter standard clubs, working with an under-11s team. So we're hoping tonight to provide some insights all the way through the spectrum of the game. There'll be a few topics that we'll dive into. I'll be asking the guys for their opinions on a number of subjects. And as Marcus said at the start, if you have any particular questions that you want answered, please just post them in the chat. We'll try and get through as many of them as we can. We started at 7 o'clock. We'll finish at 8 o'clock, just like any normal coaching session, 7 to 8. And we'll try and work through as much as we can. So without further ado, if I'm just going to get the guys to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some content. So Ben, would you mind going first, just introducing yourself and your background?
Evening all, Ben Bartlett, currently employed as the head of academy coach at the football club. I guess principally have spent a number of years now trying to support the learning and development of coaches, but principally with the idea of affecting the players through the coaches. I guess coach and player development are probably pretty much one and the same thing. As much as possible, if we're trying to affect coaches, we're doing it for the benefit of the players that are in their care. Looking forward to chatting tonight with you guys, obviously with Scott and with Stuart. So look forward to the next hour.
Cheers, Ben. That's brilliant. Scott, would you mind going next? Just giving us a bit about your background and your role.
Yeah, sure, Mike. Evening all. Hope you're all well. My name's Scott Guyett. I am head of sports science and strength and conditioning at Crystal Palace Football Club. I've held the role now for almost 10 years. It's a long time to be at one club. And we are just sort of on the back of a very long, quite challenging period of overseeing our sort of coronavirus protocols. So, yes, a very, very challenging time. We've got about a week left till we restart the Premier League. So I think everyone's pretty much looking forward to that now. And I look forward to your questions tonight.
Cheers, Scott. I know the guys will be interested in exploring the work that you guys have been through there in the Premier League. Stuart, do you want to introduce yourself? Last but not least, of course.
No, that's fine. Suits me. Evening, everyone. My name's Stuart Lamb, and I'm a grassroots coach currently coaching my son's under-11s team, under-12s going into the new season whenever that may commence. I've been involved in coaching since my son was a sort of mini kicker, sort of 5, 6 years old, and I was one of the parents that didn't step back when we were asked who'd like to get involved in coaching. But I've loved every minute of it, so it's been great.
Thanks, guys, and obviously thank you for joining us. So I think we're just going to dive into some really topical sort of pieces of conversation, and just really want to get your insights, and we'll treat this as a bit of a roundtable discussion of sorts as we work through, and then we'll finish with some Q&A at the end. So I guess we're currently trying to operate through a pandemic, an unprecedented pandemic. None of us have been here before, and we don't know how long things will go on for, what the future might look like. But I guess if we go all the way back to perhaps when we were almost put into lockdown, as it's commonly known by the government, and we were all at home and players were at home, I just wondered how you dealt with that and how you kept your players connected. We've got, as I said at the start, a wide range of different sort of experiences here, with Scott dealing with pros, Stuart dealing with some 11-year-olds. So I don't know, Scott, if we maybe start with you at the top end of the football pyramid, how did you guys manage to stay connected with your players when everybody was locked down at home?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Yeah, look, I mean, just as you were explaining that, I was thinking back to how this sort of all came about, and I can remember it was, I think it was a Thursday. We were training as normal. We had Bournemouth on the Saturday away, and we were coming in slightly later than normal on the Friday to train. We usually train and then travel. We usually train at 11 o'clock. We'd put training back, I think, to sort of 1 p.m. and we were traveling down to Bournemouth in the afternoon. That Thursday night, I think Mikel Arteta came out on Sky News that he had contracted coronavirus, and there was then an emergency meeting on Friday morning to decide whether the Premier League weekend games were going to go ahead. It was decided in the end that they weren't, and that pretty much was the beginning of this coronavirus period. At the time, initially thinking back,
you've been placed on hold. Please wait.
We never really knew how long we were going to be. So that was the most difficult thing, not really knowing what to do with the players, and how long we would have the players in sort of this sort of coronavirus period. So it was difficult to sort of get an idea of what to do. And initially, we just thought, look, this is going to be something that will probably last for maybe 2 or 3 weeks. So we tried to keep on top of the players as much as we could. So we did that through, Zoom calls. We did that through WhatsApp groups. So we allocated each member of staff 5 or 6 players, and their duty was to sort of, keep in contact with the players as regularly as possible. Run a few Zoom calls as well. But then we kind of realized that this was going to be a long-term thing. And then we started to pull back a little bit, because I was conscious of being on top of the players too much. And after sort of the initial 2 or 3 weeks, we sort of had a better picture of what was going to go on.
Brilliant. No, it's really good. Ben, I don't know if you want to talk about the kind of challenges you had and how maybe you stayed connected with the players at Fulham. I think we might have lost Ben. The tech issues rumble on. Stuart, I'll come to you at the other end of the grassroots football pyramid. Are you able to talk about how you managed to connect with your players? We're talking 11-year-old grassroots players here that were sort of sent home from school and everything. How did you find that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was obviously a very difficult time for everyone, and obviously we got lots of kids who just love playing football and other sports, and it can be very difficult for those really active ones that suddenly there's no sport available for them. But one of the things which I did was just to try and keep the kids sort of interacting socially, just aside from playing FIFA and Fortnite on the PS4, really, was setting up a weekly I started off as a one-off quiz, so just a football quiz via Zoom. We didn't use Teams, we used Zoom, and then just using a website called My Quiz. And I think we had about 16, 17 of the children do that first quiz, and they all seemed to really love it. Had really positive feedback from the kids, from the parents. And since then, we do it every Wednesday afternoon since. So I think we're up to quiz 10 now. And I'm actually running out of questions. That's my biggest challenge at the moment. But started off as football quiz, but now we're doing very much general sports knowledge. And the kids just really seem to enjoy it. So that's how we've stayed in touch with our kids, really.
That's really good, and I guess you're definitely going to be running out of quiz questions soon. But I don't know if
yes, if anyone's got any, please send them my way.
I think many of us, obviously, as football coaches, when that type of thing happens, we immediately can be, thinking about the football and trying to keep the players engaged through football tasks. And I'm sure we, did some of that. But I think what you just said there, Stuart, is really important. That social side of it and keeping the players connected that way is almost equally as important. I don't know, Scott, did you have similar thoughts with the players at Palace? I'm sure you had home programs and the rest of it for the players to do to keep fit. But how did you engage with them socially, sort of specifically?
Well, like I said, Mike, the players we're dealing with, a lot different. From young players. I mentioned it before, we had to find a balance really between being too much on top of the players, but at the same time ensuring that they were following the training programs that they were sent. And that's why we kind of did it in small groups, because, I was conscious of the fact of, having 4 or 5 coaches contacted a player every day, and constantly getting text messages, from coaches. So, what we said from the start was that, this one coach is hello?
I think we might have just got hello? Ben in. Ben, are you there?
Yeah, I'm on the phone here, yeah. Can you hear me in the...
We can, yeah. We've got you back in on the call now, Ben, yeah.
Okay.
How odd. Scott, carry on, mate. Sorry, apologies about that, and apologies, everyone. We're still having some technical issues keeping everybody on the call. Scott, carry on. We've now lost Scott as well by the look of it.
I think Scott's muted himself.
Ben, are you still there?
Hello.
Hello. Ben, we were just talking about, whilst we were trying to retrieve Scotty, we were just talking about Stuart's experience of engaging players with almost away from football and socially, and Stuart shared with us that he's been delivering quizzes with his under-11s team. I don't know if you can give us any insight into any work that you're aware of at Fulham or elsewhere in the game that's been going on, keeping players engaged socially. I think we're all guilty of considering the football side of things and home programs and all the rest, but I don't know if you've got any thoughts on keeping the players connected from a social perspective.
Yeah, I guess I've missed quite a bit, so if some of these things have been repeated, I apologise. But I guess when the first lockdown first occurred, we were all very much just at full tilt, trying to respond and put as much content out as possible. And I think we quite quickly realised that we probably needed to take a step back, allow people to get a sense of all of the things that were going on in their lives, both homeschooling and otherwise, before we start to worry too much about content. And I think the really powerful thing was the coaches in our environment who have a strong connection with the boys and then also with some of the boys' families. And I think those that have invested a huge amount of time and energy in building those strong relationships, as well as supporting the players to get better at football, have probably reaped the rewards of that investment. There's been great examples of coaches that have been able to recognise the right time of day to phone, perhaps homes where boys don't have significant male figures in the house, where the coach's phone call at a particular moment in time can be really supportive. families where parents are key workers who are charging out and fulfilling a really important job, who perhaps don't have loads and loads of time to invest in trying to understand the content that we've put forward. So I think as much as possible, it was trying to ensure that the coaches developed an even stronger connection with both the players and their families, and then made good judgments and positive judgments about the type of stuff to engage the boys in. So it became a little bit more individual. From a more performance based perspective towards the top end of the academy with the under 18s and the under 23s, we've seen some really good work in terms of understanding the work that's gone on this season and then trying to make sure that content that players have been exposed to aligns with some of the things that they've been previously challenged to do. So with one of our age groups at the top end, there's been some really strong work that one of the coaches has done on leadership, and then trying to engage with the boys that have done a strong amount of work this season on leadership to lead some of the programme that the players were being encouraged to take part in. So whether that's Strava running groups, whether that's individual analysis sessions, whether that's people coming together for one-to-one workshops with each other. So trying to ensure that some of the stuff that's been built over the number of years that the boys and the coaches have been working together can be continued, and we don't just throw out arbitrary content. Also think, one of our guys was keen about this being a slow drip. The perspective that this was going to be a long-term thing is probably, if we perhaps went too hard too soon, we may find ourselves 3 or 4 weeks in having exhausted a lot of the content. So trying to take a steady, slow drip, building people up towards it, and then finding moments and opportunities for players to get breaks. I think listening to some of the stuff that Scott said at the beginning, the kind of return to play is going to be a really interesting challenge. Trying to get a sense of when we may go back to fixtures, and also when we may then be able to access training, what training will look like, and how then we'll get a run to ensure that we're as prepared as we possibly can be for the beginning of a new season.
That's really good insight. Thanks, Ben. I think what we're hearing so far is that sort of an individualised approach to this whole thing has been really successful, whether that's in the professional game and certainly in the grassroots game with some of the work that Stuart's doing. And I think trying to support each other is another thing that I kind of made a note of there, where everybody's going through a situation that none of us have been through before, and trying to support each other. And what I mean by that is whether you've got families with key workers, as you've referred to, or boys with players with challenging backgrounds, just trying to personalise things and try and keep everybody together has been really, really successful. I suppose what the challenge still is for all of us is we still don't really know what the future looks like. I know, Scott, you've got a bit more certainty over a games programme that you've got coming up, but certainly for Stuart and for us working in grassroots football, that's a lot more uncertain. I don't know, Stuart, if we can come to you, kind of where you're at in terms of thinking about the future, and obviously the lack of certainty on it and lack of knowledge of how you can come back to playing matches. Certainly, how are you finding that with the players, the lack of no future plan really?
Yeah, I think obviously we're quite a few weeks into this now, and like I say, we've got the advice, the government advice, and then the FA advice in terms of small group training, etc.
Yeah.
And I guess what we're waiting for is, and I'm sure a lot of people are in the same boat, is for your individual club to sort of publicise what their stance on that is at this moment in time. But certainly from my own personal point of view, and I may be different from a lot of people that are attending this evening, but I'm not in any great rush to get the kids back formally training. That's my own personal opinion. I think that if clubs do start to do some small group training in line with the FA advice, the key thing for me is that there's no pressure put on anyone to participate. Whether that is a child, pressure on the parent, and also for the coaches as well. Because people have got lots of challenging things going on in their life at this moment in time, and I think for me it's about keeping the kids. If the kids are, playing football, able to at the local park with the parents, if they're playing in the back garden, if they've got a garden, just keeping them active. Running, doing anything really. For me, that's the key, and I know we're hearing that a lot of times from the schools and the school teachers at the moment, but very much the child's mental health is paramount at this moment in time. No, so that's kind of my stance on that, really.
No, that's really good insight as well, Stuart. And the challenges we face in the grassroots game, as you say, are that We have some guidance that stems from government around, working in small groups at the moment, naturally with social distancing. That might be appropriate for some of our players, but I suppose for some of our other players, maybe it's not. And to Ben's point around, an individualised, almost player-centred approach, that's really got to be considered, isn't it? With those types of sessions. If you've got, if you're running a session with really young players, do the kids know that they're not actually going to be able to tackle each other, and the sessions are going to look very different. So I don't know, Scott, you're working in an environment where these challenges have been worked through so swiftly, naturally, given the context of the Premier League and everything that's gone on with it. How have you found sort of preparing the players for the future? How has that all worked with you guys?
Yeah, it's been a challenge, Mike. We had so many protocols, so many rules that we needed to follow, and like you said before, we've never been in this situation before, and it was really quite strict. We had inspectors down, or have certainly in the last 2 weeks, we have a Premier League representative that attends every training session to ensure that we're doing everything correctly. And they will also send down randomly 2 other inspectors to ensure that all the protocols are being followed. So we've had to be we've had to be really strict with everything, from how far the players park away from each other when they turn up. They have to have their temperatures taken while they're still in the car. For the first few weeks, there was no food. They're not allowed to shower. So it's been a real challenge. It's certainly taken the players out of their comfort zone.
Yeah.
But one of the key things, key messages that we gave to the players, or wanted to get across to the players, was that, there is nothing we can do about it. So, get on with it. Because working with these lads, they do like their little luxuries, and when you change their routine, they become very uncomfortable. But they've adapted quite well.
That's
we
really
are
good.
sort of we're at the back end. We're at the end of the second week of our sort of full team training. So we've had to stagger it with sort of individual work, then into small group work, and now full team training. So, but what I can say, the lads were first class, and I think they just couldn't wait to get out there and train, really. So from that point of view, it's been very good for us.
I think that's the fascinating thing. Obviously, speaking to the 3 of you ahead of this call, is that, and for coaches that are joining this call today, you might perceive that it's a whole nother world in which Scott operates in, compared to Stuart, for example, and Ben with his professional club hat on as well, having many luxuries and many things, facilities and all the rest of it. But actually, we all face similar challenges, whether you're working with professional players in the Premier League or whether you're working with grassroots players. Working through this whole scenario has presented consistent challenges for all of us. I don't know, Ben, if you can perhaps come in with some thoughts on, as a coach developer as you are, just some advice to coaches as to how they can sort of manage their way through this with so much uncertainty in terms of trying to support their players.
I guess the sort of stuff about throwing content out is probably good if it's the stuff that people need. I guess as much as the likelihood that people are learning football through video and through conversation is probably unlikely. They probably need to be playing football, like the game of football, to actually learn it. However, what we probably can do is deepen the connection with players, deepen connection with parents, and probably just demonstrate the degree to which we care about them and their families. And what that may then generate for us and afford us is, when we do return to something that resembles normality, is that care and attention and thought that we've demonstrated will probably buy us favour, credit, and deepen those relationships even further when we return to some kind of process of football coaching. I guess it's also important that the coaches are often the bearers of a lot of this pressure and tension. And many coaches, particularly in the grassroots setting, see the coaching element as their own kind of release of their own challenges that they face in their working and day-to-day home life. I think it's probably important that as coaches, we find ways of just trying to connect with each other to ensure that any challenges, well-being, mental health issues that any of us might be facing get an opportunity to be aired. And I guess what we've tried to do as staff at our place is, as much as there's been kind of formal content and formal meetings, is just try and make opportunities to pick up the phone, to have a face-to-face with people, to make sure people are going out and doing some exercise, spending time speaking to near and dear if they're not able to be physically connected to them. So just, I guess what football is brilliant for is for human connection, and I guess as much as possible trying to maintain that human connection and care for each other, which will probably sustain us and support us when we return to playing football.
No, again, some really good insights there, Ben, just around how, coaches can perhaps be guilty, and we're all guilty of putting ourselves first at times if we're not considerate. And thinking that, we want to get back to some training, we want to get back out on the grass, but actually, further to your earlier point, is that what the players want and need? And then, for us as coaches working in the game, how we can support each other is a massive point, and how we can keep each other, mentally well, and how that we can make sure that we're in the best place so that we can be in a really good place for when we do get back in front of our players. I don't know, Scott, if we could come to you. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that in terms of how you as a staff team at Palace have worked collaboratively together to be able to provide the best service to the players.
Yeah, as a staff, we would have Zoom calls probably every 3 days, and one of the biggest issues we had was some of our foreign players. So we've got a German player, we've got a Spanish goalkeeper. We covered Dutch lads as well. And like I said, from the start, initially, we didn't know how long it was going to be. So as sort of time progressed, these players are sort of sitting in their houses and sort of weren't allowed to leave the house. So they started to ask about, was it possible to be able to go back to Holland or to Spain or to Germany?
Yeah.
And we had to support them in that, because it would have been too easy for us to turn around and sort of say, no, look, you can't go back. Max Mayer, for example, lives with his girlfriend in an apartment in central London and wasn't allowed to go anywhere. He doesn't know anyone. He's only a young lad. So we had to find a way to get him back to Germany as safely as possible. His girlfriend is pregnant as well at the time. So it was a real issue. So it wasn't, just because they're away from the training ground and they're not training, it doesn't mean that we don't sort of take any notice as such of their home situation. So no, that was quite a big task to get everyone back to their home countries safely, and even tougher, ensuring that they got back safely as well, because there were issues of getting them back into the UK. So that was one of the challenges, and I felt we managed that quite well in the end. We're quite fortunate we don't have too many foreign players, but it was one of the biggest issues we come across. Again,
it's just that theme coming up, I think, for me, of putting the player first and almost an individualised approach again, whether you've got players, foreign players, as you said, that wanted to get home, struggled to get back in, and the club support for them, versus other players that have different needs. I don't know, Stuart, if we can perhaps come over to you as well, just around your thoughts there on Ben's point around how we as coaches need to make sure we are ready to connect with these players as well, and make sure we're mentally well, make sure we're in a good place. How have you managed to do that at your club and with your coaches that you work with, your partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, we're in sort of regular contact quite a bit. It's probably something we could improve, I think. One of the things I've done is I did my level 2 last year, and I've still got to do all the paperwork and assessment around that. So I've actually taken this period as a bit of time to actually, do some of that and reevaluate my sort of coaching philosophy and look at different sessions, etc. So I've used that time from that point of view, time that as a volunteer grassroots coach with, a couple of children, doing lots of different activities, full-time job as well, and trying to do some sport myself still is quite a challenge.
Absolutely.
So I've seen some cracking examples on social media, not necessarily from the club I'm involved in, but coaches actually doing Zoom calls, and actually connecting within a club, and even partnerships of clubs as well, just keeping that communication going as well. So I think there's some really good examples out there of how coaches are staying connected. I think sort of back to that earlier point, it's really just important that at this very unprecedented time, we all sort of take care of each other really, and back to that sort of mental health issue that we're not just looking out for the sort of well-being of the children, but also ourselves. At this moment in time.
No, that's fascinating. A really, really good point that I hadn't actually thought of coming into this call, and I'll take Ben and Scott's views on it. But we're running tonight's webinar, for example, because we are aware that the majority of our coaching workforce are at home or not working perhaps as much as they used to, or have more time available to when they're not coaching, I guess, to jump onto calls like this and try and develop themselves or learn something if we're able to as a four of us on this call tonight. I don't know if Ben, we could take your thoughts on coaches using this opportunity as a great time to try and develop themselves so that they're in a better place to keep their players connected and to work with players in the future. Have you got any sort of thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess what we've tried to do is across the last few seasons is to try to have a really distinct planning process. So coaches are being more thoughtful about the reasons why they're coaching the way that they're coaching. I guess the kind of traditional top-down syllabus, which is pre-organised at the beginning of the season, which perhaps people can follow quite blindly, is not necessarily a bad thing, but not necessarily useful for coaches' reflection skills because perhaps they don't decide why they're doing what they're doing. I guess the key thing for us during this period is coaches using this time to spend time thinking back on what they've done this season and beyond, why they've done those things and how that might inform what they might do in the future. I guess as much as possible, we've tried to spend time having coaches sharing that stuff with each other, because I guess it's perhaps a bit of a cliche, but the idea that if you want to learn something, teach it to other people. And then I guess where possible to try and steer people towards whether it's a webinar, whether it's a podcast, whether it's some football footage, to try and steer people towards content that perhaps can deepen and further their understanding in relation to the things that they're trying to work out both for themselves and with the players. Because I guess like a few people have alluded to already, the risk is there is so much content out there at the moment that you can just become completely consumed by it and not necessarily know where to go, why to go there, and what to do as a consequence of exposing yourself to it. So as much as possible is trying to get coaches to deepen their understanding of why they're doing what they're doing, and then perhaps for them either to decide or for someone that supports them to decide where best to steer them. Because I was speaking with a coach just yesterday who said I think he'd been on something like 25 or 26 webinars, and he'd almost got webinar fatigue. And he was starting to reflect that he perhaps early on in the process, I guess similar to the way that we work with players, early on in the process kind of felt it necessary to consume people with content. And the risk then being that perhaps that content isn't what you need, and perhaps it doesn't help you because you're just filling your brain up with information that you're not actually able to spend the time or the practice making sense of. Yeah,
it's an absolutely valid point. I think we all probably know as coaches there's so much content out there at the moment, which is great. You are certainly at risk of webinar fatigue, and many of us that use web tools, whether it's Microsoft Teams or Zoom for our day-to-day work life, will empathise with that as well. I'm sure that webinar fatigue is certainly a thing, but this is a great time, and Ben's point there, a great time to use an opportunity to reflect back on last season to help and any previous seasons to help inform planning for future seasons. And that's great that we've now got the opportunity to do that, and coaches perhaps considering that. I just wonder, Scott, in your environment, did you have much opportunity to do much of that? Conscious that you're working in obviously a different environment to some other people on this call, but you've got professional players who it's their full-time job. They're paid obviously good money to undertake their role. But did you guys as a staff and you as an individual get any opportunity to reflect and plan for the future and even perhaps develop yourself in the meantime?
Yeah, a little bit, Mike. I mean, if I'm honest with you, I found it quite refreshing to have a little bit of a break. Once the season finishes for me, that tends to be quite a busy time because we're obviously planning the pre-season for the following season, and trips away and potential friendly games. So it was an opportunity for me to, have a little bit of downtime first and foremost, but ultimately, as we got closer and closer to that sort of return date, it ended up being busier than normal because you were having to speak to, the majority of the time you're having to speak to players on a one-to-one basis, either via text or WhatsApp or whatnot. So when you're in that training ground environment, you can speak to everyone at the one time and get across anything you need to get across. Whereas what was really, really difficult in this situation was it was, constant messages, constant kind of, if players had questions, they couldn't just, ask you the question face to face. It was a case of an email or a text message or, and when you've got 25, 30 lads asking you similar questions, it was quite difficult to manage. And that was one of the reasons why we went down that route, as I explained earlier, about, allocating a coach to small groups of players. And, the players were starting to get a little bit excited, on when they started to realise that we would be returning at some point. And, so they have hundreds of questions. They like to know what's going on. So it ended up being quite a busy time, actually. So I had a little bit of an opportunity to reflect and look over some of the things that we had done previously to see, if we can change anything or improve anything. Ultimately, we just kind of used this period really as another pre-season. That's kind of how we looked at it. So when it comes to planning for this period, we sort of based it around a normal pre-season period.
Okay, that's really good. I think just some really good themes coming up so far, guys, around just our own mental health and well-being as coaches first and foremost, the ability to be in a good place to connect with our players. The fact that there's not necessarily a rush that's come up around returning to football if it's not necessarily the right thing and we're not comfortable to do so and our players aren't ready. The way in which we engage with our players in different ways, perhaps socially, Stuart's quizzes and perhaps away from the grass slightly, and a really good opportunity to develop ourselves, learn new things, engage with other coaches and try and make sure that we're in a good place. I don't know, guys, if we can perhaps turn our attention to the future and returning to football. It's been alluded on this call already. FA guidance at the minute, allows for small group training sessions to take place, groups of up to 6 with social distancing. So you wouldn't be able to fly in 2-footed on somebody, unfortunately. So you'd have to consider your types of practice. I don't know if you guys can perhaps give your thoughts on that and how you're considering returning. I know, Stuart, you earlier sort of stated that you're perhaps in less of a rush and want to make sure it's right for the kids. I don't know if you want to give us a bit more detail on that.
Yeah, I think obviously the advice came out, it's been updated quite regularly, and I think we're just waiting for our club to sort of let us know what the overall stance is from the club's point of view, and then that will then and it's even things like facility hire, because this time of the season, the season's finished really, so we probably wouldn't even be training ordinarily now anyway.
Absolutely.
Now, if loads of grassroots clubs say to all their teams, you can go and train, where are all the? I can just foresee loads and loads of grassroots teams just descending upon any bit of green space, because that's normally what grassroots teams train during the summer. Just any bit of green space which is free to use, rather than pay during the winter. So it's just the whole practical situation of that as well, how that's actually going to work.
That's really good thoughts there.
Because the last thing you want is, you've got a park area, and then all of a sudden, one Tuesday evening, 15 grassroots teams turn up, to train on that site. So I think there's a lot more considerations there. But I think, if the club do decide that we will be returning to training as a club, I think it has then got to be down to, the individual coaches as well to feel comfortable doing that. And then, like I said earlier on, just to re-emphasise that, I think, there's certainly no pressure on any parent kid that they have to participate. They have to feel comfortable themselves, really.
No, that's a really good insight, Stuart. And I think probably a good time for me, just with an FA sort of disclaimer, that the guidance is always being updated. There's always further guidance likely to come, and we're trying our best within the FA network to provide some more support to all of our stakeholders. So some support for coaches as to what this might mean, some support for players as to what this might mean, etc., just to try and offer as much as support as we can. But it's something that's got to be seriously thought through. Scott sort of talked us earlier around the sort of risk assessments and protocols that are in place with their players returning to training, and in some respects that's similar in grassroots football. It's got to be seriously thought through, the facility implications, everything else that you've just spoken about, Stuart. So some really good insights. I don't know, Ben, if you could come in at this point with some thoughts on, I guess, grassroots clubs. You've had a good background in grassroots football, it well prior to your time at Fulham and everything else. What are your thoughts on returning to football, small groups, etc., current guidance? Where are you at with that?
I guess I suppose philosophically I have a bit of an allegiance to thinking about a constraints-led approach to coaching, and I guess the constraints that people will be under in delivering the work that they may deliver is probably an interesting way of thinking about coaching. I guess with smaller numbers, and I guess with a 2 metre guideline as it is at the moment, I think it'll be really interesting to see how people perhaps slow stuff down a little bit, perhaps spend a little bit more time connecting with the ball, perhaps players spending a little bit more time thinking about what they're doing. Because I know sometimes in the hustle and bustle of the game that perhaps the opportunity to think and consider why players are doing what they're doing can perhaps get lost in the moment. Perhaps an opportunity to slow things down, get people connecting with the ball and thinking a little bit more about what they're doing. I guess the big question in my mind, and I'd be interested in kind of Scott's views on it as well, is the degree to which kind of returning to play with a relatively short window with some of the constraints that people are under from the kind of physical things that they're able to do and not able to do, the potential risks that might bring with a return to play, both for kind of, I guess, adolescent young men, but also for fully grown adults. I think the Bundesliga, I think it was on the first day after the first day of fixtures upon return, I think there was something like 6 or 8 soft tissue injuries on that first day, and the degree to which the kind of nature of training is optimally preparing people for return and the time span that you've got for that preparation.
Okay, Scott, we're going to have to come to you then on that one as the sports scientist on the call. Just before you do, guys, just there's sort of 10-12 minutes left on this call. Any questions you want for our panel tonight, just throw them into the chat and we'll try and cover them at the end. But Scott, do you want to give us your insights there into that returning to training, in injury risk theory?
Yeah, a difficult one. It's had to be managed very, very carefully. Before we sort of came back into training, we sort of made all the coaching staff aware that, we were going to have to be very training sessions. One of the things we did is before the players were actually officially allowed back in, they were actually allowed to come into the training ground individually and do some training there. We had a couple of issues with a few of the lads in the local parks. A lot of them live over in Surrey, and they were sort of using the public parks over there, and it wasn't really conducive to what they wanted to do. So they asked if they could come into the training ground. It was allowed by the Premier League. So what we did is I gave them sent them some running drills that they could carry out at the training ground. They weren't allowed to be coached. So you're allowed to be there and oversee it, but you weren't allowed to actually coach them. So we kind of designed them around a lot of the drills that we do in pre-season. But we just had to tweak them a little bit because usually in pre-season they're working in smaller groups, whereas these were individuals. So I think that gave us a little bit of a head start when they actually came back in their small groups. So when they came back into their small groups, they were in groups of 7. So we had 7 outfield and 1 goalkeeper, and we were only allowed 4 to a pitch. So we had to manage that. So the content and the actual drill design was really important because it had to be engaging for the players. It had to be challenging. And at the same time, it had to involve a ball. So we had to sort of, introduce goals or little target goals at the end of of a run. They could, shoot the ball into the goal, those types of things. So, but at the same time, we had to be conscious of the fact that, they weren't allowed to pass the ball to each other, or they weren't allowed to have contact with each other, and had to maintain 8 meters distance, these types of things. So we actually had probably 2 weeks of that. And then we've gone back into sort of full training now. So we're, like I say, we're at the back end of our second week of full training. But we've had to be really, really mindful of ensuring that the players, don't do too much, but at the same time are ready and prepared for that first game of the season against Bournemouth. We've tried to. One of the things we have tried to do, Mike, is we tried to microdose the extensive games, because we can't have any friendlies. Ordinarily, in a pre-season period, you look to try and get 6 friendlies in. Obviously, we've not been able to do that. We've got 1 friendly, which is this Saturday against West Ham. So we've had to try and find another way of getting extensive work into the players, 11v11. So we played a number of in-house games where we've actually got the players to wear kit and shin pads, and we've tried to create an environment where that kind of replicates a competitive game as much as possible, without at the same time ensuring that we weren't just sort of hitting lads with 90 minutes of football. So for example, we played 310s, 315s, 320s. That was our program in 11v11. So they're the things that we've had to consider. Obviously, we've got the advantage of additional subs when we come back. I think we're allowed to make an extra couple of subs, so that will help. But at the same time, a lot of it may be just crossing the fingers and hoping the lads are able to get through the final 9 games.
I find it fascinating with this sport of ours that there's such differences in the game, from certainly at the top elite end and all the way down into grassroots, but there's so many consistent challenges as well, and consistent things. Scott, you're talking there around how you've tried to manage the load for your players when they came back from lockdown. Sure, your guys are fit as a fiddle, but coming back from working on their own in parks and at home to returning to training and gradually increasing that. And to be quite honest, that's a consideration, as Ben pointed out, for grassroots coaches, for working even with young players, and certainly players that are hitting maturation. That's a real consideration for us and for the environment we work in. So I find it fascinating that there's these similarities too. And Scott, I think we're just going to pick up some questions in a minute. But Scott, before I do, just on the subject of similarities, I remember talking to you, and one of the challenges we face in grassroots football, and Stuart alluded to it, is facilities, lack of space, and not knowing you've got a quarter of a pitch, or you've got a square of a park. And I know that, strangely enough, you've had some challenges with that recently, with only having one pitch available. Would you be able to just share some insights as to how you've sort of worked through, I guess, that challenge at the club?
Yeah, again, I mean, we've got 3 full-size training pitches at our first team training ground, and when we knew this, we would be training over what is essentially the off-season. The club made the decision to dig up 2 of the pitches in preparation for next season. So obviously that left us with sort of 1 full-size pitch and a few little runoff areas. I think I've sent you the sort of the mapping of how we set it out, Mike. So feel free to pass that on to anyone who's
That's
interested.
Great. We'll share that. Sorry, Scott. Yeah, guys on the call, coaches will share. Scott shared some resources of some sessions he's done with the players and some work that he's happy. I think if we didn't have these technical issues, we could have got them up on the screen tonight, but we'll share them with you after. So no, thanks, Scott. Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah, we'll share them after. Please carry on, mate.
Look, they're not groundbreaking. Don't get me wrong. But again, we were very restricted to the area sizes and what we could do. We ended up doing it in 3 groups. So we ended up having 7. I think we had a group at 7 at 9 o'clock in the morning. We had a group of 7 coming in at sort of 10:30, and then we had another group coming in at sort of 12 o'clock. and we were really conscious of making sure there was no crossover on those groups as well, because again, it was really strict that they weren't allowed to be within sort of 8 meters of each other. So we were worried that obviously the boys hadn't seen each other for a long time. So when they left the pitch, they had to go a certain way, and the players that were coming in had to come another way, so there was no crossover. So that's kind of how we managed it, really. We just did them in smaller groups. It was easier to manage as well. Like, one of the things, I don't know if many of the grassroots coaches have the same problem, but when you get sort of 25 lads all together and they haven't seen each other for a long period of time, that they are like kids and they get very excited and they're joking and mucking around. It's a lot more difficult to manage. So we tried to make the groups a little bit smaller, but at the same time, obviously, conscious of the fact that if you have too many groups, you'll be there all day. So we felt that 7 outfield and 1 goalkeeper was enough, and we could get enough into them with that number of players.
All right, brilliant, and thanks for that, Scott. I just as we've been going, guys, on coaches, I've been trying to cover your questions as we've been going. I'm conscious we're slowly running out of time. There's one question I want to pick up, probably mainly maybe Ben and Stuart, you might be able to contribute to this, but what are your thoughts on, would it be best, do you think, for coaches to wait until government guidance allows more players to train together as opposed to small groups? I don't know. Ben, have you got any thoughts on that perhaps first, and then Stuart, we'll come to you as well.
It probably depend upon the kind of purpose of the club. If the kids just fundamentally want to come and play games and be around each other and enjoy playing football, then I would probably suggest that if you're bringing them back to be involved in activity that inherently isn't why they come to football practice, then it may be that just generates more frustration than it does actually enjoyment of the game. I guess if you're in perhaps, I don't know, it depends upon your purpose, but if you're in a more intentional environment where perhaps you want to get the boys back, start to do some more physical work. If you've got young women that play, that perhaps you could spend some time working on some technical stuff and generating a social environment, albeit from 2 meters apart, then I guess it's important to look at what the purpose of your environment is and then decide the things that you'll be able to generate from bringing people back to football and whether that's a benefit. And I guess fundamentally, and perhaps most importantly, probably ask the players. Ask the men, ask the women, ask the boys, ask the girls what it is that they want out of football and what they would derive from coming back. And then I guess maybe that would inform your decision. I guess what similar to was alluded to earlier, I guess we'd probably need to be really careful about applying any kind of social pressure that because 4 or 5 are coming back, that the other 4 or 5 feel like they need to come back to not be left out. And trying to make sure that we mitigate that as much as possible, that people are making decisions that they're comfortable with and that are actually in their best interest.
That's a really good point, and that theme, player-centered, comes up again, doesn't it? And trying to make sure that we're considerate of the players' needs and trying to look after their well-being as much as possible. Stuart, have you got any views on that? Whether it's best to wait until we can have more people at the session?
No, just really echo what Ben said. Really, I think if your club is following that advice and allowing you as a coach to do some sessions. Again, for me, it just comes back to the purpose of those sessions. Have you got the facilities to do that session as well? And just what the overall, I think as Ben said, what you don't want to do is, you announce you're going back to training and there's pressure from everyone else thinking, oh, so-and-so is going football training now, we should be going as well. I think it needs to be, everyone's got different challenges at the moment. Everyone's got a different take on a whole host of things at the moment, which I think is very apparent. And I think you just need to be comfortable as a parent and a child to come back into that environment, really.
Yeah. I guess just probably lastly, just to cover sort of before we close the call, because I know I did say we'll start at 7 and we'll finish at 8, but I appreciate we had some technical difficulties. I guess for the three of you, if you're reflecting back, and I know we're not done yet, and we're a long way off being done yet, back to normal football as we knew it. But if you're to sort of reflect back on the experiences you've had trying to connect with your players through lockdown, through a pandemic, when you do get back to normal, is there anything that you might consider changing? It's a question really that's come through the chat, but I think it's a really good one just around these experiences we've been through. Is there anything that you would change in your practice when you do get back to some sense of normality with your players? Scotty, do you want to pick that one up first for us?
Yeah, I would probably say the first week of our pre-season. There's always quite a lot now. The balls are out, and you don't do as much running. But I think there's real validity in sort of getting the players running. And for that first sort of 6 sessions that we did, we couldn't do anything else but. And don't get me wrong, it wasn't sort of running without the ball. It involved the ball as well. But I think it's since the boys have actually gone back into full team training, they've actually looked really good, and not as sort of rusty as I thought they would look. And speaking to a few of them, they found a real benefit in doing that sort of out and out conditioning work, and that's ultimately what it was. It was just sort of pitch-based conditioning work, but with a ball. And I think a few of them, kind of, like I say, found a real benefit in it. And what it's done, I think it's allowed them obviously to go back into full team training now, a lot more confident and feeling a lot better, because they do get a little bit anxious when it comes to going back into full training and playing competitive games. There is a little bit of anxiety there, but I think overall that was probably the one thing I'll look at is perhaps tweaking the first maybe 5 to 6 days of pre-season and sort of concentrating more on just general fitness work.
Okay, no, thanks for that, Scott. Ben, I guess same question to you. Is there anything, reflecting back on this period, that you're considering doing differently when normality returns?
Hopefully. I think the challenge is, I guess, for everybody, is that you kind of go from running at 150 miles an hour to standing still very quickly when lockdown occurred. Yeah. And what's been really good in this period is that you've had lots of conversation and lots of time to think about what everybody's doing and why they're doing it, which can hopefully inform what people do when they go back. I think the real challenge is going to be to ensure that as much as possible you can put that opportunity into the program when everybody is running at full speed again, to be able to think about what it is that you're doing and continue to use some of those opportunities to reflect and build your skill. Because I think otherwise the risk is the season starts, and aside from perhaps the odd conversation and the odd moment in the car, it's very difficult to spend time genuinely thinking and reflecting on practice and changing behaviour. And as much as possible, trying to ensure that we punctuate the programme with as many of those as possible to ensure that we're continuing to learn while we're going at full tilt.
Brilliant. No, I think that's a very valid point. We as coaches are very guilty of just working at 100 miles an hour. And if any lesson is to come from this, maybe it is the opportunity to reflect and consolidate our practice and our learning as we go is certainly beneficial. Stuart, have you got any thoughts on any sort of reflections, more quizzes for your guys, perhaps?
Well, to be honest, that's what the take I was going to have on this is just around that a little bit more as well. Because I'm coaching under 11s, going into under 12s next season, and we've got a number of boys who they're all starting secondary school next year, and they're all going to be spread across about 3, 4, 5 secondary schools within the area. Yeah. So they're not going to get that chance to see each other at the primary school they're at anymore. They haven't seen each other for sort of 3 months now. No. So I think, when we do get back to playing football, I'm certainly going to place a higher emphasis on that social interaction side of things as well. Not just playing football, but outside of football as well. And I think my biggest takeaway from all of this is I'll never take it for granted ever again, rushing around on a Saturday morning, getting my Dawson's gymnastics, then going to put some goals up, and things that in the sort of day-to-day life you do take for granted. But I think moving forward, I'll never take that for granted ever again.
Really good. No, I think I'm conscious of time. That's a great note to finish on, I think. And we did say at the start of the call that we would try and stick to time for everybody's benefit. Hopefully this evening has been helpful for all coaches on this call. We've obviously tried to give perspectives from the whole way through the football pyramid, from Stuart working with grassroots under 11s going into under 12s, to Ben, who's had a whole host of experience in the grassroots game and now working in the professional game with young players, all the way up to adults, and of course Scott at the senior end of our game. I just want to say a massive thank you to you three guys for coming on the call tonight. It's massively appreciated by us at Surrey FA, by me personally, and I'm sure by everybody on the call. I guess the last thing to say is that FA guidance and government guidance constantly changes. You know, we never know quite what the future holds. We're certainly intending to share more guidance with everybody to try and help with returning to football, with coaching, with how to connect with players, etc. But our dedicated coronavirus page on our Surrey FA website is on the screen now, so all of our updates will always be posted on there. Again, just a thank you to all of you for joining the call. Thank you to the 3 speakers. Have a great evening, and we'll catch up with you soon. Bye bye.